Hello there, and welcome to Earth's history, where we explore the moments that transformed our planet, where catastrophe and innovation intertwine, where the waste product of one form of life becomes the foundation for entirely new possibility. Tonight, we're journeying to one of the most consequential events in Earth's history, a revolution so profound that it fundamentally altered the chemistry of the entire planet, an environmental disaster that killed almost everything alive, yet ultimately made possible all the complex life we see today, including us. This is the story of the Great Oxygenation Event, sometimes called the Great Oxidation Event, or the oxygen catastrophe, which occurred approximately 2.4 billion years ago. It's the story of how tiny bacteria invented a new way of living, how their success filled the atmosphere with a gas that was poisonous to almost all life, how the world turned toxic for billions of organisms, and how the survivors of this catastrophe inherited a planet transformed, a world where oxygen, once a deadly poison, became the fuel for a new kind of life, more energetic, more complex, ultimately more capable than anything that came before. If you've ever taken a deep breath and felt grateful for the air, if you've ever wondered why oxygen is so essential to your existence, if you've ever considered how radically different Earth once was, you're about to discover something both terrifying and beautiful. The oxygen you breathe, the oxygen that powers your cells, the oxygen that makes your existence possible, was once the deadliest pollutant on Earth. It killed on a scale almost unimaginable, wiping out perhaps 99% of all life. But from that catastrophe came opportunity, evolution, innovation, and eventually us. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable, settled in, ready to journey back to a time when Earth was utterly alien, when the sky was a different color, when the oceans were rust-colored with dissolved iron, when life clung to existence in an atmosphere that would kill you in seconds. Maybe you're lying in bed, breathing slowly, feeling the oxygen flowing into your lungs. Maybe you're sitting peacefully as day transitions to evening. Maybe you're in that quiet space where you can imagine yourself in another time, another world, witnessing the most dramatic environmental transformation in Earth's history. If this journey into deep time brings you wonder, if it helps you appreciate the extraordinary nature of the air you breathe, if it makes you reflect on how life and environment shape each other in profound and sometimes catastrophic ways, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone else who finds meaning in understanding how our world came to be. So settle in, let your breathing slow, feeling each breath, each exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide that keeps you alive. Let your thoughts drift back through billions of years to a world that was home to life, but would be utterly lethal to you. And let's begin. Because somewhere in the ancient oceans, in shallow sunlit waters, tiny bacteria were doing something revolutionary, something that had never been done before in Earth's history. They were learning to split water molecules, to harness the energy of sunlight, to release oxygen as waste. They didn't know they were about to poison the world. They were just living, just surviving, just doing what worked. But that simple innovation, that new metabolic pathway, would change everything. Before we can understand the Great Oxygenation Event, before we can grasp the magnitude of what happened, we need to understand what Earth was like before oxygen. In the first 2 billion years of our planet's history, we need to imagine a world so different from ours that it seems like another planet entirely. A world where the air would kill you, where the chemistry of rocks and water and atmosphere followed completely different rules. Earth formed about 4.54 billion years ago from the collision and accretion of countless smaller bodies orbiting the young sun. For the first few 100 million years, Earth was a hellish place, molten or semi-molten, bombarded by asteroids and comets, with no solid crust, no ocean, no atmosphere as we'd recognize, just a ball of hot rock and metal gradually cooling and differentiating as heavy elements sank toward the core and lighter materials rose toward the surface. By about 4.4 billion years ago, Earth had cooled enough for a solid crust to form, and soon after, for liquid water to condense from the atmosphere, creating the first ocean. This early Earth, in the Hadean Eon, was still violent and hostile. Volcanic activity was intense. Asteroids still occasionally struck with devastating force. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide and water vapor and nitrogen, but there was no free oxygen, none of the O2 that makes up 21% of our atmosphere today. Life appeared surprisingly early, possibly by 4.1 billion years ago, if controversial evidence from ancient zircon crystal is correct. Certainly by 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, based on more accepted fossils and chemical signatures. This early life was microbial, single-celled organisms organisms that lived in the ocean, probably in warm environments like hydrothermal vents where chemical energy was abundant. These first organisms were anaerobic, meaning they lived without oxygen. In fact, oxygen would have been toxic to them, a highly reactive gas that damages biological molecules, that interferes with the metabolic processes they used for life. The early organisms got their energy from chemistry, from reactions between different inorganic substances, hydrogen and carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide, ferrous iron, and various other compounds. This anaerobic world persisted for over 1 billion years. Life existed, diversified, evolved, but it remained entirely microbial, entirely dependent on anaerobic metabolism, entirely confined to environments where oxygen didn't exist. And oxygen didn't exist in significant quantities anywhere on Earth's surface, not in the atmosphere, not dissolved in the oceans, not trapped in rocks or minerals. The atmosphere of early Earth was what we call a reducing atmosphere, dominated by gases like nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen, ammonia, gases that either lack oxygen entirely or that would readily react with oxygen if it appeared. If somehow oxygen was produced, it would immediately react with these reducing gases or with minerals on Earth's surface, being consumed faster than it could accumulate. The oceans too were reducing, lacking dissolved oxygen, but rich in dissolved iron, manganese, and other metals that had leached from rocks through hydrothermal circulation. These oceans would have looked strange to us, probably greenish or rust-colored rather than blue, full of dissolved substances that precipitate out in the presence of oxygen, but remain in solution in its absence. The rocks at Earth's surface reflected this reducing environment. Ancient sedimentary rocks from before the Great Oxygenation Event show features that only form in the absence of oxygen. They contain minerals like pyrite and uraninite that are stable without oxygen, but oxidize and break down when exposed to it. They lack the red color of oxidized iron that characterizes many younger rocks. They show chemical signatures, ratios of elements, isotopic composition that indicate formation in an oxygen-free environment. This was the world for Earth's first 2 billion years, a reducing world, an anaerobic world, a world where oxygen was rare and confined to tiny local environment, where it never accumulated in the atmosphere or ocean, where life thrived without it and would have been poisoned by it. But then, something changed. Somewhere around 3 to 3.5 billion years ago, a group of bacteria evolved a revolutionary new form of metabolism. They developed oxygenic photosynthesis, the ability to use sunlight to split water molecules, to extract hydrogen for building organic matter, and to release oxygen as a waste product. This innovation was cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, though they're bacteria, not algae. Cyanobacteria are still around today, living in oceans and lakes and even on land, still performing the same photosynthetic process they invented billions of years ago. They're responsible for some of the most ancient fossils we have: stromatolite, layered structures formed by mats of cyanobacteria growing in shallow water, trapping sediment, building up layer by layer over years and centuries. The evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis was one of the most important innovations in the history of life, comparable to the origin of life itself or the evolution of the cell. It allowed organisms to tap into an almost unlimited energy source, sunlight, rather than being dependent on chemical energy from hydrothermal vents or other geological sources. It allowed life to colonize any sunlit environment, not just the limited areas where chemical energy was available. But photosynthesis came with a cost, a deadly byproduct. When cyanobacteria split water molecules to get hydrogen, they released oxygen, and oxygen in the anaerobic world of early Earth was poison. Why is oxygen toxic? It's highly reactive. Oxygen atoms want electrons, and they'll take them from other molecules through oxidation reactions. In cells, oxygen can oxidize lipids in membranes, proteins that perform vital functions, DNA that stores genetic information. It can generate reactive oxygen species, superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, hydroxyl radicals, that damage cells even more severely. Modern organisms that use oxygen have elaborate systems for managing it safely. Enzymes that neutralize reactive oxygen species, antioxidant molecules that scavenge damaging radicals, repair systems that fix oxidative damage to DNA and protein. But early organisms lacked these systems. They had evolved in an oxygen-free world and had no defenses against this toxic gas. When cyanobacteria first evolved oxygenic photosynthesis, probably around 3 to 3.5 billion years ago, they began releasing oxygen into their local environment. But this oxygen didn't accumulate. It was immediately consumed by reactions with dissolved iron and other reduced substances in the ocean, with methane and hydrogen in the atmosphere, with minerals on the seafloor. For over 1 billion years, cyanobacteria produced oxygen, but that oxygen was soaked up by the reducing capacity of Earth's environment. It's like pouring water into a dry sponge. The sponge absorbs the water until it's saturated, and only then does water start to accumulate in the container. Earth's reducing capacity was the sponge, and cyanobacterial oxygen was the water being poured in. During this period, roughly from 3 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, cyanobacteria multiplied, spread through the oceans, formed extensive mats in shallow waters, pumped out oxygen continuously. The oxygen reacted with dissolved iron in the ocean, causing it to precipitate out as iron oxide, rust, sinking to the seafloor and forming distinctive layered deposit called banded iron formation. These banded iron formation, or BIF, are some of the most economically important rock formations on Earth. They're the source of most iron ore used in steel production. They're also geological evidence of the oxygenation process. The bands represent seasonal or cyclical variations in oxygen production or iron availability, with iron-rich layers alternating with silica-rich layers, creating the distinctive striped appearance. BFs formed extensively from about 3 billion to 1.8 billion years ago, with a peak around 2.5 to 2.4 billion years ago, right before the Great Oxygenation Event. This timing is significant. It suggests that oxygen production was increasing, that more and more dissolved iron was being oxidized and removed from the oceans, that Earth's reducing capacity was becoming saturated. And then, around 2.4 to 2.3 billion years ago, something dramatic happened. Oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere, not slowly, not gradually, but relatively suddenly in geological terms, over perhaps just a few tens of millions of years, maybe less. The oxygen content of the atmosphere rose from nearly 0 to perhaps 1 to 2% of current levels, possibly higher in some estimate. This was the Great Oxygenation Event, the moment when the sponge became saturated, when oxygen production finally exceeded consumption, when the waste product of cyanobacterial photosynthesis began to accumulate in the atmosphere and oceans, transforming Earth's chemistry, poisoning the anaerobic life that dominated the planet. The evidence for the Great Oxygenation Event comes from multiple sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. Around 2.4 billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere changed from reducing to oxidizing, from oxygen-free to oxygen-bearing. One line of evidence is the disappearance of minerals that can't exist in oxygen. Before 2.4 billion years ago, we find detrital grain, particles eroded from rocks and transported by rivers, of pyrite and uraninite in ancient river deposits. These minerals form in rock, but normally oxidize and break down when exposed to weathering in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Their presence in river deposits indicates they could survive transport, which means the atmosphere lacked oxygen. After 2.4 billion years ago, these detrital grains disappear. You don't find pyrite or uraninite pebbles in younger river deposits because they oxidized before they can be transported. This disappearance marks the appearance of oxygen in the atmosphere. Another line of evidence is the appearance of red bed, sedimentary rock colored red by oxidized iron. Before the Great Oxygenation Event, such rocks are rare. After it, they become common, indicating that iron in soils and sediment was being oxidized by atmospheric oxygen, creating the red iron oxide minerals that color the rock. A third line of evidence comes from sulfur isotope. In an oxygen-free atmosphere, ultraviolet light from the sun causes mass-independent fractionation of sulfur isotope, creating distinctive patterns in the ratios of different sulfur isotopes in minerals. This signature is found in rocks older than 2.4 billion years, but disappears afterward. The disappearance indicates that oxygen in the atmosphere was absorbing UV light, preventing the mass-independent fractionation, providing strong evidence for atmospheric oxygenation. Together, these lines of evidence paint a clear picture. Around 2.4 billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere underwent a dramatic transition, gaining oxygen for the first time in the planet's history. But how much oxygen? This is harder to determine. The oxygen level didn't jump immediately to modern levels of 21%. Most estimates suggest the initial rise brought oxygen to perhaps 0.1% to 2% of the atmosphere, maybe as high as 10% in some models, but certainly much less than today. It was enough to transform the chemistry of the surface, enough to be detected in the geological record, enough to be toxic to most life, but not yet enough to support the kinds of oxygen-dependent life we see today. And the rise wasn't smooth. After the initial oxygenation, around 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen levels seemed to have fluctuated, possibly dropping again, possibly staying relatively low for over a billion years. There may have been a second, larger oxygenation event around 600 to 800 million years ago, the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, that brought oxygen to near modern level and enabled the evolution of large, complex animals. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to that first oxygenation, to the period around 2.4 billion years ago, when oxygen first began to accumulate, when Earth's environment transformed, when life faced the most severe environmental crisis in its history. Imagine you're a microbe living in that ancient ocean, one of the countless anaerobic bacteria that had thrived for billions of years. Your world is stable, familiar. You live in warm water, maybe in a tidal pool or shallow marine environment. You extract energy from hydrogen sulfide or iron or other reduced chemical. You've never encountered oxygen. Your ancestors never evolved defenses against it. Your metabolism is exquisitely tuned to an oxygen-free environment. And then, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, your world changes. The water around you begins to contain oxygen, brought by currents from regions where cyanobacterial mats are producing it faster than it can be consumed. At first, it's barely detectable, trace amounts that don't affect you much, but the concentration rises. Parts per billion become parts per million. The oxygen begins to interfere with your metabolism, to damage your protein, to oxidize your cell membrane. You try to move, to swim, or drift to deeper water, where oxygen hasn't penetrated. Some of your population succeed, finding refuge in deep ocean basins, in sediment, in any environment that remains oxygen-free. But others are trapped, unable to escape fast. The oxygen damages them beyond repair. They die, their cells lysing, their organic molecules breaking down, their lineages ending. This scene played out across the ocean, in every environment exposed to the rising oxygen. It was a mass extinction, probably the largest in Earth's history, in terms of the percentage of species affected. We can't know the exact toll, because we have no fossil record of most of these microorganisms. They were too small, too simple, didn't fossilize well, but based on the dominance of anaerobic metabolism before the event and the requirement for oxygen tolerance after it, most researchers estimate that the Great Oxygenation Event killed the vast majority of species, possibly 99% or more. This wasn't a quick extinction like the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. It unfolded over millions of years as oxygen levels gradually rose, as environments progressively became uninhabitable for anaerobic organisms. Some lineages went extinct quickly, unable to tolerate even low levels of oxygen. Others retreated to refugia, to environments that remained anaerobic. Deep oceans, ocean sediments, hot springs, the guts of other organisms. These anaerobic lineages still exist today, still thriving in oxygen-free environment, still using the same metabolisms their ancestors used in the anaerobic world. But the surface of Earth, the atmosphere, the shallow ocean, the land became oxidizing, became dominated by oxygen, became hostile to anaerobic life. This transformation created a crisis, but also an opportunity. Oxygen, despite its toxicity, is also an incredible fuel for metabolism. Organisms that could learn to tolerate it, to manage its reactivity, to use it safely, gained access to a form of energy production far more efficient than anything available before. Aerobic respiration, the use of oxygen to oxidize organic molecules and extract energy, produces roughly 15 times more ATP per glucose molecule than anaerobic fermentation. This is why you breathe, why your cells have mitochondria, why complex active life requires oxygen. The energy density of aerobic metabolism is so much higher than anaerobic metabolism that it enabled entirely new possibilities. Larger cells, more complex organisms, active lifestyles, eventually multicellular life, and all the diversity we see today. But evolution of aerobic metabolism didn't happen overnight. It required multiple innovations: enzymes to manage reactive oxygen speed, electron transport chain that could safely use oxygen as a final electron acceptor, regulatory systems to control oxygen-dependent metabolism. These innovations took time, millions or tens of millions of years, as organisms gradually adapted to the oxygenating world. The first organisms to make this transition were probably bacteria, some of which evolved the machinery for aerobic respiration and became the ancestors of mitochondria, the organelles that perform aerobic respiration in eukaryotic cells. cells. These early aerobic bacteria found themselves in a world full of oxygen, but with relatively few competitors capable of using it, an opportunity to diversify and thrive. Meanwhile, cyanobacteria, the organisms responsible for producing the oxygen, were also affected, but in different ways. They had to protect themselves from their own waste product, developing enzymes and antioxidant systems that allowed them to perform photosynthesis without being poisoned by the oxygen they released. But they had an advantage. They were already adapted to local oxygen production, had already evolved some protective mechanisms, and now found themselves in a world where their lifestyle, photosynthetic, oxygen producing, gave them access to abundant sunlight. Energy. Cyanobacteria proliferated, forming extensive mats and blooms, producing more and more oxygen, driving the oxygenation process forward. Their success was catastrophic for anaerobic organisms, but beneficial for themselves and for the few organisms that could adapt to oxygen. The Great Oxygenation Event also had profound effects on Earth's climate, effects that nearly froze the entire planet in what's called the Huronian glaciation, one of the longest and most severe ice ages in Earth's history. Here's how it happened. Before oxygenation, the atmosphere contained significant amounts of methane, produced by methanogenic archaea, organisms that generate methane as a byproduct of their metabolism. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, much more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. In the oxygen-free atmosphere, methane could accumulate, helping to keep Earth warm, despite the sun being about 20% dimmer than it is today. But oxygen reacts with methane, oxidizing it to carbon dioxide and water. As oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, it began to destroy the methane, removing this greenhouse gas and replacing it with the weaker greenhouse gas carbon dioxide. The result was a dramatic reduction in the greenhouse effect, a cooling of Earth's climate. At the same time, increased weathering of rocks due to oxygen in the atmosphere was consuming carbon dioxide, removing it from the atmosphere and locking it into carbonate mineral. This further reduced the greenhouse effect. The combination of methane destruction and carbon dioxide removal caused temperatures to plummet. Ice began to form at the pole, spreading toward the equator. The white ice reflected more sunlight back to space, cooling the planet further in a runaway feedback process. Earth entered a severe glaciation, the Huronian Ice Age, that lasted from about 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, with ice covering much of the planet, possibly extending to the equator in a snowball Earth scenario. This glaciation was a secondary consequence of the Great Oxygenation Event, a climate catastrophe triggered by the chemical transformation of the atmosphere. Life, which had already been devastated by oxygen toxicity, now faced a second challenge: freezing temperatures and ice-covered oceans that limited the availability of liquid water and sunlight. How life survived this period is not fully understood. Probably some regions remained ice-free, volcanic areas, deep oceans, equatorial zones that escaped glaciation even at its life retreated to these refugees, persisted through millions of years of cold, and eventually, as carbon dioxide from volcanic outgas accumulated again, as the ice began to melt, life recovered and expanded. But the world that emerged from the Huronian glaciation was fundamentally different from the one that entered it. It was an oxygenated world, an oxidizing world, a world where aerobic metabolism was possible and advantageous, a world where the chemistry of rock and water and atmosphere followed new rules. Let's consider the long-term consequences of the Great Oxygenation Event, the ways in which oxygen transformed not just the atmosphere, but the entire Earth system, enabling new forms of life, new geological processes, new planetary dynamics. First, oxygenation changed the mineralogy of Earth's crust. Before oxygen, certain minerals like pyrite and uraninite were stable at the surface. After oxygen, they oxidized, breaking down, being replaced by new minerals, iron oxides, sulfates, other oxidized forms. This created new types of rocks, new ore deposits, new geochemical cycles, the red rocks we see in deserts, the rust-colored soils, the iron ore deposits that fuel industry. All are consequences of oxygen in the atmosphere. Second, oxygenation transformed the ocean chemistry. Before oxygen, oceans were rich in dissolved iron, manganese, and other reduced metals. After oxygen, these metals precipitated out, forming sediment, clearing the water. Oceans transitioned from turbid, metal-rich waters to the clearer, oxidized waters we know today. This transformation took a long time, billions of years in some respect, but the process began with the Great Oxygenation. Third, oxygenation enabled the formation of the ozone layer. Ozone, O3, forms when oxygen molecules are split by ultraviolet light and the free oxygen atoms recombine with other oxygen molecules. This ozone absorbs UV light, protecting Earth's surface from harmful radiation. Before oxygen accumulated, there was no ozone layer, and UV radiation penetrated to the surface, damaging DNA and limiting where life could exist. After oxygen accumulated and ozone formed, life could colonize surface waters and eventually land without being sterilized by UV. Fourth, oxygenation changed the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixation, the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen gas into ammonia that organisms can use, became easier with oxygen-dependent enzymes. At the same time, nitrification and denitrification, processes that cycle nitrogen through different oxidation states, became important parts of the nitrogen cycle, affecting the availability of this essential nutrient. Fifth, and most importantly for the history of life, oxygenation enabled the evolution of eukaryotes, the complex cells with nuclei and organelles that would eventually give rise to all plants, animals, and fungi. Eukaryotes arose around 2 billion years ago, possibly earlier, through a process called endosymbiosis, where an archaeal or bacterial host cell engulfed aerobic bacteria that became mitochondria. Mitochondria are the organelles that perform aerobic respiration in eukaryotic cells that use oxygen to extract energy from food. They're descendants of free-living bacteria, probably related to modern alpha proteobacteria, that were engulfed by a host cell and, instead of being digested, formed a symbiotic partnership. The host cell provided protection and resources. The bacteria provided energy through aerobic respiration. This endosymbiotic event was one of the most important in the history of life, comparable to the origin of life itself or the invention of photosynthesis. It gave eukaryotes access to the high energy yields of aerobic metabolism, enabling them to become larger, more complex, more active than prokaryotic cells. Without mitochondria, without aerobic respiration, eukaryotes couldn't exist. And without eukaryotes, there would be no plants, no animals, no fungi, no visible life as we know it. But mitochondria require oxygen. They use it as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, the last step in aerobic respiration. Without oxygen in the environment, aerobic respiration doesn't work. Mitochondria provide no advantage, and the endosymbiotic event that created eukaryotes probably wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have been successful. So the Great Oxygenation Event, despite being a catastrophic extinction, despite poisoning most life on Earth, created the conditions necessary for eukaryotes to evolve, for complex life to emerge, for the eventual appearance of plants and animals, and ultimately human. We exist because of the oxygen catastrophe, because cyanobacteria poisoned the world, because the survivors adapted to the toxic atmosphere and found ways to use it. The timeline from oxygenation to complex life was long, over 1 billion years. After the initial oxygenation, around 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen levels remained relatively low, perhaps 1 to 10% of modern level, for the next 1.5 billion years. This period, from about 2 to 0.8 billion years ago, is sometimes called the boring billion, because relatively little seems to have happened. No major glaciation, no obvious evolutionary innovation, just slow, steady changes as life adapted to the oxygenated world. Eukaryotes appeared during this period, around 2 billion years ago, but remained mostly single-celled, mostly small, mostly unremarkable for hundreds of millions of years. The diversity we see in eukaryotes today, the protists, the algae, the eventual plants and animals, and fungi, hadn't yet appeared. Eukaryotes existed, but hadn't yet exploited their potential. Then, around 800 to 600 million years ago, something changed. Oxygen levels rose again, possibly to near modern level, in what's called the Neoproterozoic Oxygenation Event, or NOE. This second oxygenation was possibly triggered by changes in tectonic activity, by the breakup of a supercontinent called Rodinia, by increased weathering and organic carbon burial that removed carbon dioxide and released more oxygen. Whatever the cause, the result was a world with high oxygen level, capable of supporting large active organisms. And shortly after this second oxygenation, complex multicellular life appeared. First, simple multicellular organisms, possibly algae and soft-bodied creatures. Then, in the Ediacaran period around 570 million years ago, the first complex organisms appeared, the Ediacaran. Biota, strange soft-bodied creatures that lived on the seafloor, some resembling modern animals, others unlike anything alive today. And then, Around 540 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion occurred, a rapid diversification of animal life where most modern animal body plans appeared within a few million years. This explosion was enabled by high oxygen levels, by the energy surplus provided by aerobic metabolism, by the ability of organisms to grow larger, to develop complex tissues and organs, to become active predators and prey. All of this, eukaryotes, multicellularity, complex animals, eventually plants and fungi, and the colonization of land, the dinosaurs and mammals and birds, and ultimately human. All of it traces back to the Great Oxygenation Event, to the catastrophe that poisoned the world but created new possibility, to the waste product of cyanobacteria that became the fuel for a new form of life. Let's reflect on what this story tells us about life, about evolution, about the relationship between organisms and their environment. First, it shows that life is incredibly powerful as a geological force. Cyanobacteria, tiny microscopic organisms, transformed the entire planet, changed the composition of the atmosphere, altered the chemistry of the ocean, affected the climate, triggered ice ages. Life isn't just passive, adapting to environment. Life actively shapes environment, changes them, sometimes in ways that feed back on life itself. This is the concept of the biosphere as a system where life and environment are intimately connected, where each influences the other. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by James Lovelock, suggests that Earth's biosphere regulates the environment to maintain conditions suitable for life. The Great Oxygenation Event challenges this view. It shows that life can transform the environment in catastrophic ways, can poison itself, can create conditions that wipe out most species. But in a broader sense, the oxygenation event is consistent with system-level thinking. Life didn't destroy itself entirely. Some organisms survived, adapted, evolved to use oxygen, and eventually thrived. The Earth system shifted to a new stable state, an oxygenated state where different forms of life dominated. The catastrophe was real, but so was the recovery, the adaptation, the eventual flourishing of new life forms. Second, the story shows that evolution is opportunistic, that innovations in one context can have unforeseen consequences in another. Cyanobacteria evolved oxygenic photosynthesis to capture sunlight energy, not to transform the planet. The oxygen they released was just waste, a byproduct. They had no awareness that this waste would accumulate, would poison other organisms, would eventually change the entire Earth system. But once oxygen accumulated, once the environment transformed, new opportunities appeared. Organisms that could tolerate oxygen, that could use it, gained access to a powerful energy source. Evolution worked with what was available, turned a poison into a fuel, transformed catastrophe into opportunity. This is a common pattern in evolution. Structures evolved for one purpose get co-opted for another. Feathers evolved for insulation, were co-opted for flight. Swim bladders evolved for buoyancy, were co-opted for lung. Environmental changes that devastate some species create opportunities for others. The extinction of the dinosaurs allowed mammals to diversify. The oxygenation of Earth allowed complex life to evolve. Evolution doesn't have foresight, doesn't plan for the future. It works with what's present, adapts to current conditions. But the innovations that arise can have long-term consequences, can open new possibilities, can transform the trajectory of life in ways that couldn't have been predicted. Third, the story shows the importance of contingency in Earth's history. The Great Oxygenation Event wasn't inevitable. If cyanobacteria hadn't evolved oxygenic photosynthesis, Earth might have remained anoxic indefinitely. Life would still exist. Anaerobic microbes thrived for billions of years before oxygen, but it would be fundamentally different. No aerobic respiration, no eukaryotes, no complex multicellular life, no animals or plants, no us. Our existence depends on this ancient innovation, on the evolution of a metabolic pathway in bacteria billions of years ago, on the accumulation of their waste product, on the survival of organisms through the catastrophe that followed, on the evolution of adaptations to use oxygen. Change any of these, and history unfolds differently, possibly without anything resembling human being. This contingency, the dependence of the present on specific events in the past, is a fundamental feature of history, biological and otherwise. We are not inevitable. We are the product of a specific sequence of events, many of which were improbable, many of which could have gone differently. The Great Oxygenation Event is one of those events, a moment when history could have branched in other directions, but didn't, and we are here as a concert. Let's consider the modern implications of this ancient story. What does the Great Oxygenation Event tell us about contemporary environmental challenges, about the relationship between human activity and the planet? One parallel is obvious. Humans, like cyanobacteria, are transforming Earth's atmosphere. We're increasing carbon dioxide level, enhancing the greenhouse effect, warming the climate. We're doing this not intentionally to change the climate, but as a byproduct of activities we engage in for other reasons. Burning fossil fuels for energy, clearing forests for agriculture, producing cement and other industrial materials. Like cyanobacteria, we're powerful enough as a species to alter the entire planet. Like cyanobacteria, we're releasing substances that accumulate in the atmosphere faster than natural processes can remove them. Like cyanobacteria, we're triggering changes that will have consequences for all life, including ourselves. But there are important differences. Cyanobacteria had no awareness of what they were doing, no ability to foresee consequences, no capacity to change their behavior. We do. We can understand what's happening, can predict consequences, can make choices about how we interact with the environment. The question is whether we will. The Great Oxygenation Event shows that life can survive massive environmental transformation, that ecosystems can shift to new stable state, that evolution can adapt to changed conditions. But it also shows that such transitions are catastrophic for most species, that survival often requires retreating to refugia, that recovery takes millions of years. We don't want to be the organisms that go extinct, that fail to adapt, that are replaced by species better suited to the changed environment. And we certainly don't want to trigger a mass extinction comparable to the oxygen catastrophe, wiping out most species and radically transforming Earth's ecosystem. The good news is that we have something cyanobacteria lack: intelligence, foresight, the ability to modify our behavior based on understanding of consequence. We can choose to reduce our impact, to transition to sustainable technology, to protect ecosystems and biodiversity. We can be not just powerful geological forces, but wise ones, using our intelligence to avoid catastrophe rather than cause it. The Great Oxygenation Event also reminds us that Earth's environment is not fixed, not stable, not necessarily favorable to life as we know it. The planet we inhabit is the product of billions of years of evolution, of countless interactions between life and environment, of catastrophes and recoveries and transformation. The oxygen we breathe, the climate we enjoy, the ecosystems we depend on, all are contingent. All are maintained by ongoing processes. All could potentially be disrupted. This should inspire both humility and responsibility. Humility, because we are small actors on a planetary stage, dependent on systems vastly larger and more complex than ourselves, systems that evolved over billions of years and that we only partially understand. Responsibility, because despite our small size, we have become powerful enough to affect those planetary systems, to disrupt the balances that maintain habitability, to trigger changes whose full consequences we cannot predict. The oxygen in our atmosphere, which seems so permanent, so reliable, is actually maintained by ongoing biological processes. Photosynthesis by plants and phytoplankton, respiration by animals and decomposers. A continuous cycling that keeps oxygen levels relatively stable. Disrupt those processes, destroy too many forests, acidify the oceans, interfere with the organisms that produce and consume oxygen, and the atmosphere could change, not on billion-year timescales like the Great Oxygenation Event, but on timescales of centuries or millennia, fast enough to matter to us and to countless other species. Let's return to the deep past one more time to consider the perspectives of different organisms experiencing the Great Oxygenation Event. To understand this catastrophe, not just as abstract chemistry, but as lived experience for the creatures who endured it. Imagine you're an anaerobic bacterium, a methanogen living in ocean sediment. Your world is dark, warm, rich in the reduced compounds you need for metabolism. You've been living this way for billions of years. Not you personally, but your lineage, essentially unchanged since the earliest days of life. You split hydrogen from H2, combine it with carbon dioxide, produce methane as waste, extract just enough energy to survive and reproduce. The oxygenation happens far above you, in the sunlit surface, waters where you never go. The oxygen takes time to penetrate into the sediments where you live, absorbed by reaction with mineral, with organic matter, with other reduced substances. For a while, you're protected, insulated from the catastrophe unfolding above. But gradually, over thousands or millions of years, the oxygen penetrates deeper. The boundary between oxic and anoxic zone moves down, compressing the habitable space for anaerobic organisms like you. Your population shrinks, confined to an ever smaller refuge. Some of your cousins, those living in shallower sediment, have already died out, unable to tolerate even traces of oxygen, but you survive. Your lineage persists in the deep anoxic sediment, in the guts of animal that will evolve billions of years later, in hot spring and other extreme environments where oxygen never penetrates. You're still alive today, in a sense. The methanogenic archaea living in anaerobic environment are your direct descendants, still using the same metabolism, still producing methane, still thriving in the oxygen-free niches that persist on an otherwise oxygenated planet. Now, imagine you're a cyanobacterium, one of the organisms responsible for producing the oxygen. You live in a shallow tidal, part of a dense mat of organisms growing in layers. During the day, you photosynthesize, using sunlight to split water, releasing oxygen that bubbles up through the mat and escapes into the atmosphere. At night, you respire, using organic matter you've produced to generate energy. You're not aware of the transformation you're causing. You're just living, doing what works, exploiting the abundant sunlight that no other organism can efficiently use. But your success is changing the world. The oxygen you and billions of your relatives produce accumulate, transforms the atmosphere, alters the ocean chemistry. You have some defenses against your own waste product: enzymes that neutralize reactive oxygen species, proteins that repair oxidative damage. But these defenses are imperfect, costly to maintain. You live in a constant state of stress, managing the poison you create, balancing the benefits of photosynthesis against the damage from oxygen. But you survive, you proliferate, you spread. Your lifestyle becomes dominant in shallow sunlit waters. The energy advantage of tapping into sunlight is so great that despite the costs, despite the toxicity of your waste, you outcompete organisms using other metabolism. You inherit the earth, or at least the sunlit portions of it. And now imagine you're one of the early aerobic bacteria, an organism whose ancestors survived the initial oxygenation by evolving the ability to tolerate and eventually use oxygen. You're still rare, still a minor component of the ecosystem, but you have access to a resource, oxygen, that most organisms can't use and that exists in increasing abundance. You live near cyanobacterial mat in the oxygen-rich waters just above them. You've evolved an electron transport chain that uses oxygen as a final electron acceptor, extracting far more energy from your food than anaerobic organisms can manage. This energy surplus allows you to grow faster, to reproduce more quickly, to invest in defensive structures and capabilities that less energy-rich organisms can't afford. You're opportunistic, feeding on the organic matter produced by cyanobacteria, on the remains of organisms that die from oxygen toxicity, on the detritus in oxygen-rich water. You find yourself in an ecosystem with abundant resources and few competitors. You diversify, evolve different strategies, spread to new environments. Your descendants will include the mitochondria, the organelles that power eukaryotic cells. Billions of years in the future, every plant and animal and fungus will carry your relatives inside their cells, using the aerobic metabolism you pioneered to power complex multicellular life. You don't know this, can't know it, but your innovations will shape the future of life on Earth more profoundly than you could ever imagine. These three perspectives, the anaerobic survivor, the oxygenating perpetrator, the aerobic innovator, represent the major responses to the Great Oxygenation. Some organisms retreated to oxygen-free refuge and persist there still. Others, the cyanobacteria, continued their oxygenating metabolism and became enormously successful, dominating primary production in the oceans for billions of. Still others adapted to use evolved aerobic metabolism and opened entirely new evolutionary paths. The event was a catastrophe, a mass extinction, an environmental disaster, but it was also an opportunity, a transformation, a moment when new forms of life became possible. Both perspectives are valid. Both are part of the story. Evolution is not gentle, not kind, not directed toward any particular end. It's a process of variation and selection, of survival and extinction, of catastrophe and opportunity intertwined. Let's consider one more aspect of the Great Oxygenation Event, its implications for the search for life beyond Earth. Astrobiology and the question of whether we're alone in the universe. Oxygen is considered a biosignature, a gas whose presence in a planet's atmosphere might indicate biological activity. This is because oxygen is highly reactive and doesn't doesn't persist in atmospheres without a continuous source. On Earth, that source is photosynthesis. Without life continuously producing oxygen, atmospheric oxygen would react with rocks and gases and disappear on geological timescales. When astronomers search for habitable planets around other stars, when they analyze the atmospheres of exoplanets looking for signs of life, oxygen is one of the key gases they look for. The detection of oxygen, especially in combination with other gases like methane, that wouldn't coexist in equilibrium without biological activity, would be strong evidence for life. But the Great Oxygenation Event teaches us that oxygen in an atmosphere is not just evidence of life, but evidence of a specific kind of life, photosynthetic life, specifically oxygenic photosynthesis. It took Earth 2 billion years to develop oxygenic photosynthesis after life first appeared. For half of Earth's history, the planet hosted abundant life, but had no atmospheric oxygen. If we were observing Earth from another star system at different times in its history, we would draw very different conclusions. Before 2.4 billion years ago, we'd see no oxygen, no obvious biosignatures in the atmosphere, and might conclude the planet was lifeless. After 2.4 billion years ago, we'd detect oxygen and infer the presence of life. This has implications for how we think about life in the universe. Planets without oxygen in their atmospheres might still host abundant microbial life using anaerobic metabolism, life similar to Earth's for its first 2 billion years. Such life would be invisible to our current detection method, undetectable from interstellar distances. It also suggests that the path from simple life to complex life might require oxygenation, might depend on the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis and the transformation of the atmosphere. If oxygenic photosynthesis is rare, if it's a difficult innovation that arises only on some planets with life, then complex life might be correspondingly rare, even if simple microbial life is common. This is related to the concept of the Great Filter in discussions of the Fermi paradox, the question of why we don't see evidence of alien civilizations if life in the universe is common. The Great Filter is some step in the progression from non-life to technological civilization that is extremely difficult, that most planets fail to pass. Perhaps the Great Filter is the origin of life itself, or perhaps it's the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis, the oxygenation of the atmosphere, the transition from simple to complex life. If the Great Oxygenation Event is the Great Filter, it would explain why we don't detect alien civilization. Most planets with life might be stuck at the microbial stage, never developing oxygenic photosynthesis, never oxygenating their atmospheres, never evolving complex life or intelligence. Earth would be unusual, lucky, having passed through the filter successfully. This is all speculation, of course. We don't know how common life is in the universe, don't know how difficult oxygenic photosynthesis is to evolve, don't know whether oxygen is necessary for complex life, or whether alternative biochemistries could work. But the Great Oxygenation Event reminds us that the path from simple to complex life is not straightforward, not inevitable, and involves major transformations and catastrophe. It also reminds us that a planet's habitability is not static, but evolves over time, shaped by the life that inhabits it. Earth was habitable for anaerobic life for 2 billion years, then became habitable for aerobic life after oxygenation. These are fundamentally different states, hostile to different forms of life, maintained by different biological and geological processes. When we search for habitable planet, we should remember that habitability is not just about being in the right temperature zone around the right kind of star. It's also about the planet's history, its geological activity, its atmospheric composition, the types of life that might have evolved there, and how they've transformed the environment. A planet might be habitable for some forms of life, but not others. Habitable at some times in its history, but not at others. Let's turn to one final implication of the Great Oxygenation Event, what it tells us about the nature of progress in evolution and in history more generally. There's a tendency to view evolution as progressive, as moving from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, with humans as the pinnacle, the end point, the goal toward which evolution was working. The Great Oxygenation Event challenges this view in important ways. First, it shows that evolution doesn't work toward any goal. Cyanobacteria didn't evolve oxygenic photosynthesis to make the world better for future complex life. They evolved it because it worked for them, because it gave them access to sunlight energy. The consequences, atmospheric oxygenation, mass extinction, eventual appearance of complex life, were all unintended, unforeseen, emergent, from the simple fact of cyanobacteria doing what worked in their immediate circumstance. Second, it shows that environmental transformations are neither progress nor regress from the perspective of the organisms experiencing them. For anaerobic organisms, oxygenation was catastrophic, a disaster that destroyed their world. For aerobic organisms, it was an opportunity, the creation of new possibility. There's no objective standard by which to judge which perspective is correct. Both are valid from their own standpoint. Third, it shows that complexity is not inevitable. For 2 billion years, Earth was inhabited entirely by simple microbial life. This wasn't a temporary stage, a waiting period until complex life could appear. It was a stable state, an ecosystem functioning successfully with only microbes. Complex life didn't appear because it was destined to, because evolution was striving toward it. It appeared because specific conditions, high oxygen levels, made it possible, and because once possible, the energy advantages of aerobic metabolism favored its evolution. On another planet, or in another timeline of Earth's history, life might remain simple indefinitely. There's nothing wrong with this, nothing missing. Simple microbial life is successful, adaptable, capable of thriving in diverse environments. Complexity is not inherently better, just different, suited to different circumstances. And yet, from our human perspective, from inside the stream of history, there is something remarkable about the progression from simple to complex, from microbes to animals, to conscious being capable of understanding their own origin. Not remarkable because it was destined, but remarkable precisely because it wasn't, because it depended on specific contingent event, like the Great Oxygenation Event. We exist because cyanobacteria oxygenated the atmosphere, because some organisms survived and adapted to oxygen, because aerobic metabolism enabled larger cells, because those larger cells formed symbioses that became eukaryotes, because eukaryotes eventually became multicellular, because some multicellular organisms developed nervous systems, because nervous systems enabled complex behavior and eventually consciousness. Each step in this progression was contingent, could have not happened, depended on specific circumstance. The chain is long, fragile, improbable in retrospect, and yet here we are, the products of that chain, capable of looking back and marveling at the journey. This should inspire both humility and wonder. Humility because we're not the goal, not the purpose, not the reason the universe exists. We're just one outcome among many possible outcomes, lucky beneficiaries of a series of fortunate events. Wonder because despite the contingency, despite the improbability, the universe generated us, generated consciousness, generated beings capable of contemplating their own existence and the vast history that produced them. As we near the end of this journey, let's return to the present moment, to you, sitting or lying wherever you are, breathing oxygen, depending on it for every second of your life. Each breath you take, each inhalation of oxygen is made possible by the Great Oxygenation Event, by cyanobacteria billions of years ago, transforming the atmosphere, by the survival and adaptation of organisms through that catastrophe, by the evolution of aerobic metabolism and all the complexity it enabled. The oxygen enters your lung, diffuses across thin membranes into your bloodstream, binds to hemoglobin in your red blood cells, travels through your circulatory system to every tissue in your body. There, in your cells, in the mitochondria descended from ancient aerobic bacteria. The oxygen participates in aerobic respiration, the final step in the electron transport chain, accepting electrons and combining with hydrogen to form water. This process, this use of oxygen to extract energy from food, produces the ATP that powers everything you do. Every thought, every movement, every heartbeat, every cellular process depends on this continuous flow of oxygen and the energy it helps generate. Without oxygen, your mitochondria would stop working. Your cells would die within minutes. Your brain would lose consciousness within seconds. You are an aerobic organism, utterly dependent on oxygen, carrying inside your cells the descendants of bacteria that learned to use this once poisonous gas. You live in an oxygenated world, breathing an atmosphere transformed by life, benefiting from a catastrophe that occurred 2.4 billion years ago. And you're not alone. Every animal, every plant, every fungus, every organism complex, enough to be visible to your eyes, depends on oxygen, directly or indirectly. The plants photosynthesize, producing oxygen just as cyanobacteria did billions of years ago. The animals respire, consuming that oxygen to power active lifestyles. The fungi decompose organic matter, respiring aerobically as they break down dead plants and animals. The entire visible biosphere, everything you think of as life in your everyday experience, is a product of the oxygenated world, of the transformation that began 2.4 billion years ago and continues today. Without that transformation, without the Great Oxygenation Event, Earth would still host abundant life, but it would be invisible life, microbial life, life confined to oxygen-free environment, life that never developed the energy budgets necessary for complexity. There would be no forests, no flowers, no birds or insects or mammals, no eyes to see, no brains to contemplate, no consciousness to wonder about existence. The universe would still exist, would still be magnificent and vast and full of wonders, but there would be no one on Earth to appreciate it, to understand it, to care about it. This is the legacy of the Great Oxygenation Event, the gift and the burden of living in an oxygenated world. The catastrophe that killed billions of species enabled billions more to evolve, including us. The poison that devastated the ancient anaerobic world became the fuel for a new world, richer in energy, more complex in structure, eventually conscious of. Let's take a moment to appreciate as you breathe, as you feel the oxygen flowing in and the carbon dioxide flowing out, as you participate in the great planetary cycles of photosynthesis and respiration that maintain the atmosphere, that connect all aerobic life, that have been operating for 2.4 billion years. You are part of something ancient, something vast, something that transcends your individual existence. The oxygen in your lungs was produced by photosynthesis, perhaps by a tree outside your window, perhaps by phytoplankton in a distant ocean. That oxygen will be replaced by more oxygen, produced by more photosynthesis, in a continuous cycle maintained by life. And the oxygen you exhale, in the form of carbon dioxide, will be taken up by plants, incorporated into their tissues, eventually released again as oxygen by photosynthesis. You are part of the cycle, a participant in the Great Oxygenation that continues today, that transforms the atmosphere continuously, that maintains the conditions necessary for your existence. This is not just poetry, not just metaphor. It's literally true, physically real, measurable in the chemistry of your breath, the metabolism of your cells, the composition of the atmosphere. You are connected to every other aerobic organism through this shared dependence on oxygen, this shared participation in planetary cycles, this common ancestry going back to the organisms that survived the Great Oxygenation Event and learned to use oxygen instead of being poisoned by it. As we conclude this journey through deep time, as we return from 2.4 billion years ago to the present, let's reflect on the lessons of the Great Oxygenation Event, on what this ancient catastrophe tells us about life, about change, about the relationship between disaster and opportunity. First, it reminds us that life is powerful, that organisms can transform entire planets, can alter atmospheres and oceans, and the chemistry of rock. This power is not unique to humans, though we may be uniquely conscious of it. Cyanobacteria, tiny and simple, transformed Earth more profoundly than any other organism in history. We should remember this when we think about our own impact, our own transformation of the planet. We're not the first to change the world, but we may be the first with the capacity to understand what we're doing and choose how to do it. Second, it reminds us that environmental change can be catastrophic, can drive massive extinction, can destroy ecosystems and force survivors into refugia. But it also reminds us that life persists, adapts, finds ways to survive even extreme changes. The anaerobic organisms that dominated early Earth didn't go completely extinct. They retreated to oxygen-free environments and persist there still. Life is resilient, not in the sense that it's indestructible, but in the sense that as long as some organisms survive, life continues, evolves, eventually diversifies again. Third, it reminds us that catastrophe and opportunity are two sides of the same coin, that the same event can be devastating for some species and liberating for others. The Great Oxygenation Event destroyed the anaerobic world, but created the conditions for aerobic life, for complexity, for everything we value and recognize as life in our everyday experience. This doesn't make the catastrophe less real, doesn't minimize the extinction, but it does show that evolution works with what it has, finds opportunities in changed conditions, creates new forms adapted to new circumstances. Fourth, it reminds us that the world we inhabit is not eternal, not unchanging, not guaranteed to remain habitable for us. The atmosphere we breathe, the climate we experience, The ecosystems we depend on, all are products of specific historical processes. All are maintained by ongoing biological and geological cycles. All could potentially be disrupted. We should not take our world for granted, should not assume it will always remain as it is, should understand that we live in a particular moment in Earth's long history, a moment shaped by everything that came before. And finally, it reminds us that we are part of something vast and ancient, that our existence depends on events that occurred billions of years ago, that we carry within us the legacy of organisms that survived catastrophes we can barely imagine. Every breath you take connects you to that ancient story, to the cyanobacteria that oxygenated the atmosphere, to the aerobic bacteria that learned to use oxygen, to the mitochondria in your cells that descended from those bacteria, to the long chain of evolution that led from simple cells to complex organisms to conscious being. You are here because the Great Oxygenation Event happened, because some organisms survived it, because the world transformed from one state to another, enabling new possibility, new forms of life, new levels of complexity. You breathe oxygen because cyanobacteria learned to produce it, because the atmosphere accumulated, because your ancestors evolved to use it. You exist because of a catastrophe, because of an environmental transformation, because life poisoned itself and then learned to live with the poison. This is your inheritance, your history, your connection to the deep past. The oxygen you breathe is ancient, not in the sense that the same molecules have persisted, oxygen cycles rapidly through the atmosphere, but in the sense that the process that produces it, the system that maintains it, the biological foundation that makes it possible, all are ancient. All go back billions of years. All connect you to the earliest days of complex life on Earth. As you go about your life, as you breathe and move and think, remember occasionally where you came from, what made you possible, what ancient events shaped the world you inhabit. Remember that you're part of a story that began billions of years ago and continues into an unknowable future. A story of transformation and adaptation, of catastrophe and survival, of life continuously reshaping itself and its environment in an endless dance of change. The Great Oxygenation Event was one chapter in that story, perhaps the most dramatic, certainly one of the most consequential. It shows us that life is powerful, that change is constant, that catastrophe and opportunity are intertwined, that the world is not static, but dynamic, shaped by the living things that inhabit it. And it shows us that we are beneficiaries of that ancient catastrophe, breathing the poison that devastated early life, using it to power our existence, dependent on it for every moment of every day. We live in an oxygenated world, shaped by the Great Oxygenation Event, carrying forward the legacy of the survivors, the organisms that adapted, that learned to use what once was deadly, that found opportunity in disaster. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for traveling back 2.4 billion years to witness the transformation of our planet, for contemplating the catastrophe that made your existence possible. May this knowledge bring you appreciation for the air you breathe, understanding of the deep history that shapes your present, and awareness of your connection to all life, past and present. All of us descendants of survivors, all of us breathing the same oxygen, all of us part of the same ongoing story of life on Earth. Rest well, breathing deeply, feeling the oxygen flow, grateful for the ancient catastrophe that made everything possible, connected to the vast sweep of history that brought you here, to this moment, alive and conscious in an oxygenated world.